Morning, sisters and brothers. Oh, we can do better than that, surely. Good morning, sisters and brothers. Okay, like you can tell, I'm from London. Yes, I'm British. Okay. Now, I was told that this was a dialogue, but it seems that a dialogue has to be between two parties, and I haven't been hearing much from you guys. So we need to change that. We need to bring you into things a little bit more, because I think that everybody has to be a teacher and everybody has to be a leader. Okay. So although we've only got 15 minutes, they've allocated 15 minutes for me. It didn't say how long they'd allocated for you. So it may take a little bit more time. Okay. Now the thing I want to talk about is documenting and retelling the story of the diaspora. But I think that if we're going to document it, if we're going to retell it, if we're going to understand it, we have to understand it from where we are. And like it or not, we're in Britain. So we have to understand the history of the diaspora from a British perspective. We have to understand the history of Africans in Britain, as well as the history of Africans in the Caribbean, in America, in Africa, and elsewhere. But even though this is Black History Month here in Britain, Britain is always left out of the equation. Okay, so we're going to bring Britain back into the equation, because it's my understanding that Britain has played a pivotal role, a crucial role, not only in the creation of the diaspora, but in Africans recreating themselves in the diaspora. And so I'm going to bring you in, and we're going to have a dialogue, an exchange. And the only thing you have to remember is that the central focus of this dialogue is Britain. Okay, everybody ready? Everybody ready? Yes. Okay, so we're going to see how much you know. Okay. So I said that Britain played a crucial role in the creation of the diaspora, because through slavery, through colonialism, it was Britain that was a very key force in all of that. Okay, so we're going to start off now. You ready? Okay. So which country was the leading slave trading power in the 18th century? Okay, that's pretty good. That's good. Okay. Which country said it had an empire on which the sun would never set? Okay. Which country has a government which says that slavery is not a crime against humanity? Okay, we're doing pretty good. Which country had a movement against slavery, which was the biggest political movement ever in that country's history up until today? Very good. Okay. In which country was there an organization called the Sons of Africa, which played a leading role in that struggle against slavery? Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, I'm going to ask you another one now. This might be a bit more difficult. In which country was the first African woman poet, or African American if people want to say that? In which country was the first African American woman's poems published? Very good, yes, Phyllis Wheatley, very good. Okay, let's do a bit more. In which country was the first African-American novelist published? Very good, yes, William Wells Brown. Okay, let's do another one. Now I'm going to leave that question because we've got too many questions here. Okay, so in the creation of the diaspora, Britain plays a central role. And in Africans recreating themselves, struggling for their rights, for their humanity against slavery, colonialism, racism, and so on, Britain also plays a central role. So I'm just going to ask a few more questions so that we continue with this dialogue to establish the centrality of Britain. Okay. The famous African-American Frederick Douglass, in which country was his freedom bought for him? Okay, well, you're a bit hesitant about that one. Yes, when Frederick Douglass came here in 1845, a runaway slave. He was still a slave, but he had some friends in Britain who actually bought his freedom. It created a very great controversy, as you might imagine. Okay, let's leave the 19th century, because I can see you're struggling a little bit with that. We'll go into the last century, the 20th century. And as I said, Britain played a central role in the efforts of Africans to liberate themselves, to engage in struggle for their liberation from racism, from colonialism, from imperialism. So, okay, let's go forward. In which country was the first Pan-African conference held? Okay. We've got some very important guests with us today. One of them is the son of W.E.B. Du Bois. So I'm going to ask you a question about Du Bois. Du Bois' famous phrase, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. In which country was that slogan, that famous saying, first mentioned? Okay, very good, yes. At the 1900 Pan-African Conference. Somebody mentioned Marcus Garvey earlier. In which country did Garvey get some of his training as a journalist and first come into contact with Africans from the continent? Okay, you're getting better. Okay, we have another very important guest with us today, a descendant of George Padmore. So in which country did George Padmore form the International African Friends of Abyssinia, the International African Service Bureau, the Pan-African Federation? Okay. In which country did George Padmore organize the most significant of all the Pan-African Congresses, the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945? Okay. We've got another very important guest with us today, the son of Paul Robeson, one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century. About which country did Paul Robeson say that the workers of that country had taught him the oneness of humanity? Okay. And about which country's capital city did Paul Robeson say that in that city he had discovered Africa? Britain, yes, right here in London. Okay. And we've also got, I believe, one of the family of Kwame Nkrumah here today. So in which country did Nkrumah become president of the West African Students' Union, organize the way? That's okay, hold on. And organized the West African National Secretariat, which campaigned for a West African Soviet Union? Britain, okay. Africa's not a country. Britain, okay. In which country did Malcolm X make one? Oh, sorry, we've also got a relative of Malcolm X with us today. In which country did Malcolm X make one of his last speeches to the Committee of African Organizations just before he was assassinated? Britain. Okay. And in which country did a communist from Trinidad start the largest street festival in Europe? Britain, yes, Claudia Jones, way back in 1959. Okay, so this is just a little bit of our history here in Britain, showing or trying to show, as we've shown each other, the significance, the centrality of Britain whenever we're discussing the African diaspora. And I've only had time for a few questions. I could have gone on for another 3 hours, at least. But when it comes to people talking about Black History Month or Black history, nobody ever talks about Britain. So are we proud of our history or are we not proud of our history? Okay. So then we have to study this history. We have to understand our history. And of course, it's only when we study it and understand it that we can draw the lessons from it. So you have helped today in our dialogue in, if you like, bringing that history to the fore. And I want to try and draw some lessons from this very important history that we have in Britain. Now, of course, I should also say that the history of Africans in Britain is not just a part of British history, but of course it's also part of the history of Africa, part of the history of the Caribbean, and a part of the history of the African diaspora in general. So it's not that we forget Africa and the Caribbean or anywhere else when we think about Britain. Okay, so what lessons can we learn from this history of Africans in Britain? Firstly, that history is about people. That it's about people like us. Sometimes you go to various meetings and you talk about things. I was at a meeting the other week and somebody said to me, what about the Queens? So why aren't you talking about queens? I said, history is not about queens. History is not about kings. History is about people like us. So when we're talking about history, let's talk about people like us. So the first lesson that we learn from this history is it's about people like us. The second thing is that history is about struggle. Don't let anybody tell you history is about anything else. History is always about struggle. And it's usually about two kinds of struggle. One is a struggle to transform nature. In other words, to use the resources of nature for our benefit. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it's about the struggle to transform ourselves as human beings, to transform the conditions we live in, to make life better, to liberate ourselves. And that's something else we must never forget. The great African-American Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there's no progress. So we always have to bear that in mind. So as I've tried to point out, as we both try to point out, in this struggle which Africans in Britain have waged, people like us have always been at the forefront. If we look at the history of Britain or the history of the diaspora, the struggles against slavery, the struggles against colonialism, the struggles against racism, here in Britain, African people have always been at the forefront. So we have to ask ourselves the question, are we at the forefront as well? Are we carrying on those best traditions that have been handed down to us? Because if we're not at the forefront of all the struggles in front of us, how are we ever going to change anything? So these are the lessons that we learn from our own history. And if we don't learn the lessons from our own history, how are we going to move forward? The third lesson that I think is important and grows out of the history here in Britain is, as I said, that Britain has always been at the center of the diaspora and its struggles. And most importantly, those Africans in Britain have always maintained and strengthened their links with Africa, the continent of Africa, and with the Caribbean. To most people here, this will be obvious, but it's something should never be forgotten about. Okay, there's the US, and the US is very important, but in all the examples I gave, there's people from the US coming here. We have to remember who we are, that we have a different history from the history of people in the US, and our history is linked with this country, or with Africa, or with the Caribbean. There are some people who don't want to acknowledge the facts of history, and they don't want to acknowledge the lessons of history. And what I was going to go on and say is that the enemies of our people, this is exactly what they always do. They say, okay, people in Britain, African people in Britain don't have a history. That African people in Britain, don't have a culture. The African people in Britain don't have languages, and so on and so forth. And if we look at what goes on in the schools in Britain and in the media in Britain, we find this denial all the time. We find that when you go to school at the age of 5, what language are you taught in? Okay, you're taught in English. You're not taught in Bajan. You're not taught in Zulu. You're not taught in Yoruba. You're not taught in Twi. You're not taught in any of these languages because these languages it's denied that these have any significance. When you go to school, you turn on the television, you don't learn about the history of African people. whether it's in Africa or in the diaspora or in Britain, because this history is not seen as being significant. And the struggles which people waged in Britain are hidden from us. And there's a very good reason. And there's a very good reason why those struggles are hidden from us, because the enemies of our people don't want us to learn the lessons of those struggles. Because if you look at the struggles of the diaspora as we have done, you see that people in Britain, Africans in Britain, always played a central role in them. Just as Africans in Britain always played a central role in the political struggles that went on in Britain itself. We can name all these people. We can name Olaudah Equiano. In fact, I noticed when we were shouting out the names of our ancestors earlier, I didn't hear any names of people from Britain. I didn't hear the name of Olaudah Equiano. I didn't hear the name of Kobina Ottobah Cugoano. I didn't hear any of the names of the Sons of Africa. I didn't hear the name of William Davidson. I didn't hear the name of Robert Wedderfern. I didn't hear the name of William Coffey, the great leader of the 19th century. No, I didn't hear any of those. I didn't hear the name of our great composer of the 19th century, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who produced the music for the first Pan-African Conference. No, I didn't hear any of those names. I didn't hear the names of people like Desmond Buckle. I didn't hear the names of people like Harold Moody. I didn't hear any of these names, because this history, people want to keep it hidden. And you know why they want to keep it hidden? They want to keep it hidden because it was a history of struggle, of uncompromising struggle, that African people in Britain have always struggled to be free, whether it's for freedom from slavery, from colonialism, from imperialism, from racism, and so on. And the point I'm making to you, brothers and sisters, is we have to understand this history. We have to learn from it. We have to learn from it. We are in Britain. We have to understand the history of Britain and the role that Africans played in it. And so when you go around today in the workshops and in the discussions and in the corridors, anytime you hear anybody say anything about Africa and the African diaspora, you think about Britain.